the Speak, Episode 4. If you want to test the true character of a man or a woman, give them PowerPoint.
Do you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch? If not, these expert discussions and insider tips can help you right now, today. Welcome to the What the Speak podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kelly.
If you've never seen the story behind how and why the What the Speak podcast got started, visit whatthespeak.com/speakbetter to watch the 90-second video. If you like what you see, send the link to someone you know. Nancy Duarte is an author, speaker, and graphic designer, best known for her influential books Resonate and Slideology. She's also the CEO of Duarte Design, a company that specializes in creating slide presentations for corporations and high-profile individuals. For example, Duarte has worked with Al Gore on the documentary slideshow known as An Inconvenient Truth. Now, Nancy's TEDx talk on the very subject that she teaches, slide design, has become very influential for a lot of speakers, many who you will hear on this show. We pull back the curtain and take a look at exactly what went on into her preparation for that presentation, which is really exciting because nobody has ever discussed this with Nancy until now. So Nancy, wow, it's like I'm in the presence of a living legend. Thanks so much for joining me, and I know you're very busy.
You need to get out more, okay? Start there.
I know for those of us that are presentation geeks, you know, Nancy Duarte, she's a living legend. So
what else would they need to know?
That's right. All right. Well, Nancy, I know that you've been interviewed so many times about this idea of presentation design and a lot of the concepts that you teach from your books, but I wanted to turn it all upside down. I really wanted to explore a new twist, a new angle with you. So let's talk about how you've personally used your ideas to create an actual presentation, something that you've given. And perhaps let's talk about the TEDx East talk that you gave a couple years ago. Does that sound cool?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
All right. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was really, before we get into the presentation part of it, how did you deal with the expectation of the quote-unquote presentation lady, you know, getting up on stage and you know, people thinking she talks about presentations, she designed presentations, you know, is she going to be good at it?
Yeah, God, that's the terrifying thing, you know, for a long time. I don't know if you might be too young to remember The Wizard of Oz, but Dorothy, they go up, there's the great powerful Oz, and there's that person behind the curtain, the real Oz. For so long, I've been the person behind the curtain making someone else look powerful, and I knew that if I had my little coming out party, I would have to be the presentation lady that presents. And so I started presenting at littler conferences, littler, low risk, nobody knew me, and really worked hard on the delivery. And then I did have a speech coach or a delivery coach that I worked with over at Decker Communication, and tried to get some of those little tics. And I actually used to say this thing where I would be like, right? Right? I didn't even know I did that. I had to be videotaped and play myself back. And so had to really work on getting some of those things kind of chiseled off. But I had to nail it. I had to nail it in 18 minutes. And the presentation lady couldn't even go 4 seconds over, right? I mean, there was a lot of pressure. Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's good to hear, you know, the things that you struggled with as, you know, being able to get up on stage and deliver that presentation, and working with a coach. You know, it's really interesting. Like, it's not, a lot of us think that we can just kind of step up on stage and wing it, and that's just not the reality.
High stakes. I knew that if I really nailed it, I was hoping, my dream was to be added onto TED.com or be asked to be on the stage or to launch some sort of a speaking career. And so for me, that was really high stakes. And I was really bummed. The talk came out and nothing happened. And it was actually a year and a half, almost 2 years later, that TED did wind up adding it to TED.com. I get an email on a Tuesday, hey, your talk's going to go up. And I just ran around here like a chicken. I was so excited because that was a big, big day. That means I kind of passed the TED test.
Yeah.
It took me 18 months to pass me, but I was really excited. That was a big day for me.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, now one of the concepts that you talk about is this idea of people needing to zero in on the big idea, the one thing that really the whole thing hinges on. So for you, obviously, it was talking about a lot of the concepts related to the story form that you discuss in your book, Resonate. But what was the actual process for you of finding the big idea for that TED Talk? I mean, sure, you could talk about Resonate, but there's a lot of content that you've got crammed in there. How did you narrow it down to that big idea?
What I did is I did my regular process. I wrote ideas out on the little tiny sticky pad, the little sticky notes, and I taped it all up on my wall. And then I would walk through it verbally. I didn't have slides. I didn't have anything. I would just walk through it verbally. Does this sound like what would be the most important thing? And I ran it, walked through, I rearranged it. Somebody else rearranged it. Someone said, strike this, strike that. You're spending too much time on that. And that makes it diminish the value of this. I really worked on it. And then we made the slides. So it's hard. You know, there's a phrase, it's hard to murder your darlings. And it was hard, but it was definitely slashy and bloody. And it was hard. And I petitioned for things to stay in, and other people petitioned for them to come out. And ultimately, I had to defer to, I could not self-judge what I was emotionally attached to versus, because there was little intellectual discoveries I had that became these little tiny sidebar comments in Resonate that were like emotionally valued to me and intellectually valued to me, but they're like, in the bigger sense, they're not, that's not what you need to talk about. And I had to believe them. And I think, I have a great team, so surrounding myself with smart people helped. But I had to actually defer to them and say, you know what, you're right, I'll let it go. And that was hard. So it almost took someone else to murder some of my darlings, someone that I trusted that would, really talk me into letting some of it go. That was hard.
I think that's a good point that you make where, a lot of us who give presentations regularly think that, we know what's best. We know what we can edit down. It's almost like we're in a vacuum. And so to hear that you did have a person, a couple of people, from the outside,
like 8.
Yep. Work with you to really help you narrow it down. That's huge. I think that's a big takeaway for all of us.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next thing I was wondering about was, how did you create the map, so to speak? You refer to it as a persuasion plan. You make a very persuasive argument in that TED Talk, which we'll link to in the show notes for this video. But, how did you go about creating what that was going to be? You talked a little bit about the stickies, but what were some of the other aspects of that process?
Are you talking about specifically what structure I used for my own talk, and did it map into that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the persuasive story structure was a discovery that I made where there's a structural pattern that you could use to establish what could be. And what's interesting about that is, like, people will ask me, well, did Dr. Martin Luther King use your shape? And I'm like, God, I was like 2. Like, no, he didn't. But what he did do was work, rework, craft, recraft, edit, re-edit, until he just knew in his heart it was a great speech. And so what's interesting is that's kind of what I did too. I'm like, let's work it and work it, work it. And then when I stood back, you can actually translate or transcribe my talk. It actually follows the form. Mm-hmm. So I didn't necessarily set out to, I gotta have my own talk, do this thing. That wasn't even really on my mind. Really what was on my mind is, how do I take this great idea and make it amazing and communicate it well? And then you step back and you're like, oh my God, it actually works, you know. And but there are ways you can use that shape to use it as a brainstorming tool. Really spend time thinking about what is. Really spend a lot of time thinking about what could be, because the contrast between the two is so powerful. It creates that tension and release. That we love so much about story. And it's hard to create that tension and release around story when you don't have a single protagonist. And so that's why this tool is great, because it does create that tension and release when you're conveying information. So, it's funny because a lot of people are like, wow, it didn't dawn on me. It sounds so dumb, but it didn't even dawn on me. So it wasn't until it got released. It's like, oh, it was so nice to see you practice what you preach. And I'm like, does it work? Does it match the format? It was weird. But what's interesting about that is my book. Every page in Resonate is a mini version of the form. And then the chapters are a mini version of the form. And then the whole book is a mini version of the form. So I was very conscious of it when I was writing the book, but completely didn't even dawn on me till I got feedback that it matches. And I was totally relieved. Yeah.
So how did you go from, all the research that you did for the book, was that essentially the basis of where you collected and created a lot of the different content for this particular presentation? Or did you pull some different sources, some different stories out that maybe you didn't cover in the book?
No, everything that was in the talk is in the book.
Okay.
Yeah. So there wasn't any, it all kind of came out of that. It's a subset of the stuff in the book. Yeah.
So then I want to hit the pause button really quick on this discussion related to the TED Talk. I'm really curious to find out, when you're researching a presentation, whether it's for yourself or a client, what's that process that you go through for collecting the information, going to different sources, throwing everything up on the wall? How do you approach that yourself?
What you want to do ideally is make these connections and insights that the audience hasn't seen before. Because if you're really an effective presenter, what you're doing is feeding them information the way a mentor does in a movie. They get a magical gift, they get unstuck, or they get a special tool. So you want to make sure you put information in there. Like, even if they go, oh my God, I never knew that. Oh my God, I've never heard that about history before. I didn't know that about that product, and I didn't know that. You want to give them these moments where they feel like they left smarter, or they feel like they had a personal revelation, or you got to kind of do those things. And so you got to build your content to that end. And one of the things that I don't remember is your original question.
So it was about, how do you actually go about the process of researching and pulling all these different ideas together?
Oh, yeah, now I remember. So what you want to do is you make sure you collect not just what you need to say, but also what would be of value to the audience. And so what I do is, first thing we do I'll do it from a client perspective. First thing we do is we get the key stakeholders in the room, 2 to 4 of them, and we hold a workshop. Sometimes it could be up to a half day if it's really big stakes and there's a lot at stake. And we have a graphic facilitator, and we'll have someone live visualizing. Well, Mr. Executive, when you said that, this is what I saw. And they'll be like, oh my God, I can see why you saw that, but that was not my intent, right? And we try to really kind of masterfully visually try to solve or say, this is what we heard. And then we go away and we break down we deconstruct everything they said, and then we reconstruct it with, different tile pieces, different putty, we reassemble it, and then we represent to them, this is what we heard, this is what we said, and this is how you can add value to the audience you're talking to. So we do spend a lot of time obsessing about who you're talking to, how do you want to change them, and all our questions are pulling that out of them. And then we actually construct the talk and visualize the talk and give it back to them.
Got it.
Does that help?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll get back to exploring how you pulled together the TED Talk. In that presentation, you have a lot of facts, but you've also carefully woven in some emotional aspects, some stories about your personal life. Can you talk about what was involved with doing that, and how you were able to take those stories that really were personal to you, and quite frankly are a lot of the moments in that presentation that I think really connect with the audience member as well. They can identify, they can empathize, all of those things.
I think what's interesting, I actually was a declared math major. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up and I went into school, because I think that's where you can see that, because the analysis is very analytical. It is an analytical process, and to be able to apply something analytical to the spoken word is pretty cool. And so I felt like it was so heavily analytical, and I've never had anyone challenge me, like an engineer, a finance person, like the typical scientists. They're just like, whoa, that looks like data, therefore it's true, right? And it is true, and it does look like data. But one of the reasons I think I ended with the story, I actually wish I'd said it a little differently at the end, because what I wanted people to know is, even though I looked totally together and masterful, I came from nothing. It was hard work to get to where I was, right? So I kind of ended with my own personal journey around communicators. And hey, if I could do this, you could do it too, because I think people are dismissive of the Steve Jobses of the world, of the Martin Luther Kings of the world. They're like, well, yeah, but they were good at it when they were born, and I wasn't. And I think that I wanted to make that clear, that for you analytical types, here's proof. And for you emotional types that are going to throw up emotional roadblocks about why you can't do this, I just kind of wanted to address it. I do think I could have done a better job of that, because some people are like, whoa, what was with your ending? Wow, freaked me out, But I put it out there, and because I felt like people needed to know that I was not born this way, and it was hard work.
I mean, honestly, I had heard about your work. I'd seen your books, but had never really explored them much. And either somebody sent me a link to the TED Talk, or I just came across it myself. And after I saw that presentation, I was like, wow, I need to learn more about, what she's talking about here. And so I went out and got Resonate. Actually got it on my iPad.
I love the iPad version.
Yes.
The version would explode. It does well, but I love the iPad version.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, all right, a couple of questions here as we wind down with our time. I did want to ask you about the journey. So when you sat down and you realized, okay, this is the audience that I'm going to be speaking in front of. This is kind of the path that I want to lead them down during the course of this 18 some odd minute presentation. What was that journey, and what was the path that you did want to lead them down?
I think the TED audience is pretty discriminating, and so I think a little bit to the point of we were just talking about with the analytical and emotional appeal. I knew that the talks that did better were inspirational. So even though it was data-like, I needed to be inspirational. I needed to be upbeat and come across as smart, because I'm not, and so it was all a big pretend thing. Those things, believe it or not, were super important to me. So as far as the journey, this was TEDx East, so it was in New York. The live audience was New York, kind of based, smart. There were there were journalists there, there were artisans there. That was a very different, doctors were there. It was actually a pretty stereotypically TED-like crowd. Yep. And I just mostly wanted them to reconsider that they could be that this was a tool I was handing them so they could be a great communicator and ultimately one day do their own TED Talk. Because I think it's intimidating to people, and it's not. Kind of takes some of the mystery out of being a great communicator.
Yeah. Okay, so the last thing is the editing process. We talked a little bit about earlier. Was that something that before you got that external feedback, how much editing of the presentation did you do yourself? And, were there certain things that you honed in on that you were like, okay, this definitely doesn't need to be in here? Anything like that you can share?
I had it pretty tight. I had kind of a deck of slides too. And I don't know, little known thing is that you can actually take your deck and print it out 9 up, cut them into little pieces, and they are the size of a sticky note. So a little 9-up thing, I cut it in pieces. So some of them were real slides, some of them were stuck. I would say 70% of them were slides I made that stayed in. But the real editing process, I say, came in rehearsal, in live rehearsal. I had a gal who actually was one of the ones that helped me edit the book. And she just was really comfortable getting in my face and even worked with me on like my inflection. And, when you say that, you spent too much time on that. You're at 30 seconds, cut it to 15. So then I had to, so we rehearsed. I just came across, I should have saved it too, because it would be fun for people to see fast forward. I came across the videotape. It was when flip cams were around, and we put a flip cam on me and you could see me rehearse. I'm like, frustrated. And I rehearse. And we cut right up until the night before. We were like trim. And I literally was like, said the last line. I looked up at the clock. I had 6 seconds left. Unflipping believable. But I swear I spent more time on that talk than anything I've ever done. But it so paid off. between YouTube, Vimeo, and TED, it has almost 1 million views. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy exciting. So a lot of the actual editing happened when I start to speak, because sometimes then I go off and I start to think out loud, and so I had to practice a lot verbally too, because I didn't want to type it out and memorize it, because you see those talks, they look like dorks. So there's this point where you rehearse like a dork, and then suddenly you pass this threshold where you rehearse and you come across as yourself. And I wanted to make sure that I kind of let the natural Nancy come through throughout the talk.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze one more bonus question in.
Your question, this is great. I've never talked about that talk, so thank you. It's
All right.
fun.
Cool. So the one thing I did want to ask you was, I was actually talking with a group of professional speakers at a conference a few months back, and one of them had made the comment to me that the TED style talk has really created something difficult for them as professional speakers, where people who are not quote unquote professional speakers are getting up and giving these talks, and that's kind of changing what an audience is expecting out of a speaker. And on top of that, the fact that it is that shorter format that's really more digestible nuggets versus something that's like an hour-long keynote presentation. So my question buried in there is, what do you think of that? What are some of your thoughts as somebody who's given a TED talk?
I agree. Like I do a talk about what has impacted presentations, and it used to be that you could suck and everyone in your organization could suck at being a presenter, but now they could be like, wait a minute, there's this geeky scientist here who did an amazing job at his 18-minute talk. So people now could be like, you suck because I see one that's better. Well, we never used to be able to compare ourselves to others. And so I am seeing that. I get asked to do usually an hour-long talk, and I only do 40 minutes. That's all I'll ever do. And if they want the extra 20 minutes as a Q&A, they can have it as a Q&A. But it's almost impossible to go an hour and be amazing and people be like, wow. You kind of want to – I don't think anyone's ever actually said the words, I wish your presentation was longer, because I can't imagine, right? So there's no such thing as too short. And so I really don't go over 40, right? Or I don't accept the engagement because I think it's not concise enough.
Yeah.
But it's definitely impacted everybody, the average Joe presenter at their company and professional speakers, because people are losing their patience. They're realizing, because 18 minutes, like a sitcom has only about 18 to 22 minutes worth of content. The rest is commercials. So really, that's about how we're programmed and conditioned. So you basically need to make yours equivalent to about an hour-long show, which is really only 40 minutes long.
Yeah.
So that's what I do. So
Excellent.
it's definitely impacted me.
Well, Nancy, thanks so much. You've been a great sport. I really appreciate your time and, of course, appreciate your insights. So thank you.
Well, you did a great job. This was totally fun. Thank you.
All right. Today's guest certainly had some amazing insights they shared. If you'd like to purchase a copy of their latest book, visit this episode's show notes over at whatthespeak.com and click the link at the bottom of the page to immediately order their book.
All right, here we go with the outro.
Thanks so much for joining us today on What to Speak. Be sure to visit whatthespeak.com for show notes on every episode and to sign up for our email list to stay updated on resources that'll help you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch.